The day they crossed the Lineth morning sun filtered softly through the stained glass windows of First Hope Memorial Chapel. Outside, American flags flapped gently in the breeze. Uniformed honor guards stood tall beside a casket draped in red, white, and blue. The town of Cypress Pines had come together to bury one of its finest. My father, Sergeant Major William Billy Rhodes, a man who had given 28 years to the United States Army and was more of a pillar to this community than any HOA board could ever hope to be. I stood in my dress blues, head in hand, next to my mother, who trembled but held her chin high. My younger brother, Mason, stood silently beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers. We were surrounded by neighbors, friends, veterans, and a handful of city officials who had known Dad well. The burial had just begun. Pastor Emerson was leading us in a prayer when it happened. I noticed the movement first, a black SUV rolling up the cemetery drive far too fast for this solemn setting. It had no markings, but the red and blue lights flashing behind the windshield made it look official. The vehicle screeched to a halt, dust kicking up in clouds. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out wearing tactical vests that simply read HOA Enforcement Division. My stomach dropped. What in the... I muttered, already stepping forward. The taller man, built like someone who watched too much reality TV cop drama, barked out in a booming voice, "This gathering is in violation of Pine Ridge HOA regulations regarding large, unpermitted assemblies on community land." Heads turned, gasps echoed through the crowd. My uncle, a retired Navy man, stood up from his seat and stared in disbelief. "This is a funeral. You jackasses. I'm gonna have to ask everyone to disperse," the woman said, adjusting her fake badge. "This is your only warning. The HOA did not approve this burial on their property. You're trespassing." I felt the heat rise in my chest like a wildfire. My fists clenched before I even realized it. These weren't real cops. These weren't even security guards. They were HOA board members playing dress-up, and they had just marched into a military funeral like they had any authority. I slowly stepped forward, my voice low, calm, but carrying the weight of command I had earned over 15 years as a decorated police officer and now Chief of Police for Cypress Pines. "Who authorized this?" The big guy tried puffing up. "This is HOA jurisdiction, and your uniform doesn't mean squat here. We have authority over Pine Ridge." "Let me stop you right there," I said, holding up a hand. "Your HOA doesn't own this cemetery. The land belongs to the city, and it's publicly registered for community and veteran services. You are not law enforcement. You are impersonating officers. That's a felony in the state of Texas." He blinked, faltered, but the woman stepped up. "We have a right to enforce community standards." I flashed my badge, "and I have the legal authority to arrest you on sight." The mood shifted instantly. Behind me, murmurs turned to whispers of support. Someone yelled, "Get him, Chief." Another cried, "How dare they disrespect a vet?" I took a breath and glanced at my mother. Her eyes were glassy, but she nodded slightly. This wasn't just about today. This was about the months leading up to this funeral, the endless harassment from the HOA, the fines, the notices about improper flag display, the ridiculous letters demanding Dad take down the flagpole he'd installed 20 years ago. The same flagpole where now the American flag stood proudly in honor of his service. "You've got about 10 seconds, I said quietly to them, "to turn around, get in that SUV, and leave, or I will place you under arrest for impersonating law enforcement, interfering with a state-sanctioned ceremony, and harassment of a grieving family." They hesitated. I stepped closer, my voice a low growl. 3, 2. They bolted back to the SUV and peeled out so fast the back tires tore up some of the grass. Gasps and cheers rose from the funeral crowd. But for me, it wasn't over. That day lit a fuse, and I wasn't going to let it burn out quietly. The war they never saw coming. 3 days had passed since my father's funeral, 3 long days, where grief battled with rage inside me like a storm trapped in a bottle. The burial, which should have been a moment of peace and finality, had been desecrated by power-hungry posers with fake badges and inflated egos. But this wasn't just about a single disrespectful incident. No, this was a culmination, a final insult in a string of escalating harassment that had plagued my family Ever since the HOA board had been taken over by a new president, Linda Cartwright, a name that had started as a minor irritation in the neighborhood had now become a warning whispered on every street corner of Pine Ridge Estates. Her eyes had been swift, manipulative, and precise. She didn't just enforce the rules, she created them, twisted them, and weaponized them against anyone who didn't bow to her vision of order. After the funeral, I stayed silent publicly, but behind closed doors, I was digging. The next morning, I sat in my office at the Cypress Pines Police Department, lights dimmed, a hot mug of black coffee cooling in my grip. My second in command, Lieutenant Torres, stepped in and silently slid a manila folder onto my desk. "We got a hit, Chief. You were right. Those weren't just rogue board members. They had an entire fake department structure on paper." I flipped the folder open and found copies of documents pulled from the state registry site. The HOA had filed paperwork to create a private community security division, a misrepresented LLC with fake badge numbers and laughable training records. But the most disturbing part, it was funded through redirected HOA fees. These people were taxing residents and using the funds to create a pretend law enforcement unit, complete with tactical gear bought from discount online surplus sites and a fleet of unmarked vehicles. The signatures on the approval forms, Linda Cartwright, acting president, and Greg Baumer, treasurer, and one of the 3 officers who'd crashed the funeral. "This is more than impersonation," I muttered, eyes scanning over fraudulent receipts and internal memos. "This is organized misappropriation of funds, racketeering, possibly intimidation, too." Torres nodded grimly. "I also found 6 complaints over the last 8 months, quiet ones. People just scared to escalate. Elderly residents, mostly talking about forced compliance visits, fake fines, threats of arrest." And there it was, the pattern. They didn't just want control. They were using fear to dominate a neighborhood of mostly veterans and retirees. And they had chosen my father, my family, as their final test of power. That evening, I returned to my parents' house, a small brick ranch on Hillside Drive, with a battered flagpole standing proud in the front yard. My mother, still in her black mourning dress, sat quietly in the living room, her hands folded around a worn photo album, filled with Dad's Army medals, promotions, and handwritten notes. She looked up when I entered, eyes tired but steady. "They've sent another fine," she said without needing to explain. I took the envelope from the side table. "Non-regulation funeral gathering," it read. "Violation of community decorum, $1,200. Penalty due in 10 days. My fingers curled around the paper. "That's the last one," I said. "They don't know who they're dealing with." "I know who they're dealing with," she replied gently. "But don't let this consume you. Your father fought wars so we didn't have to. And now they're staging fake wars in our neighborhoods." I snapped back. "He taught me to stand up to bullies. I'm not letting this slide." The next morning, I called a meeting, not at the police station, but at an old veterans lodge on the edge of town, neutral ground, the kind of place where people felt safe enough to speak freely. Word had already started to spread after the funeral incident, and by noon, a dozen families showed up, some with folders, others with trembling hands. A retired Marine named Daryl spoke first. "They fined me $500 for flying the Corps' flag on my porch. Told me it was an unauthorized banner." An older woman with a cane added, "They came onto my property, told me my birdbath was attracting vermin. They said they'd relocate it if I didn't comply." Story after story poured out like water breaking through a dam. It was more than policy abuse, it was psychological warfare. These weren't rules being enforced. They were tools of domination. I laid out the evidence Torres and I had gathered, showed them the documents, the fake police division, the budget irregularities. Eyes widened, jaws clenched. I could feel the weight of shared frustration turning into something sharper, something focused. These weren't just victims. They were ready to fight back. "I'm building a case," I told them. "But I'm not just taking this to court. I'm taking it to the state attorney. We're going to dismantle their entire operation." "But what can we do?" one woman asked. "We're just residents. They'll retaliate." "You won't be alone," I said. "And they won't retaliate if they're stripped of power. That means going public, press coverage, lawsuits, formal charges. We need to be louder than their Threats. Outside, the sky had grown dark with the approach of evening. But inside that old wooden hall, something brighter sparked unity. That night, I filed an official investigation notice to the state's Consumer Fraud Unit. The next morning, I personally served cease and desist orders to every member of the HOA board. Backed by state law, when I handed the paperwork to Linda Cartwright, who was lounging in her oversized patio chair sipping iced tea like a suburban dictator, she laughed. "Is this your little revenge tour, Chief Rhodes?" She sneered. "I warned you not to let your grief cloud your judgment. We're just protecting community standards." "No," I replied. "You were building your own little kingdom, but your castle's made of paper, and I'm setting fire to it." Linda stood up, her face tight with anger. "You don't scare me." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to bury you in legal consequences." I turned and walked away, the sound of shredded power echoing behind me. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The HOA's counterattack the next 48 hours felt like walking through the eye of a hurricane, eerily calm, deceptively quiet. I had expected immediate backlash after I served the cease and desist orders to every member of the HOA board, especially Linda Cartwright. She was the kind of person who didn't take public embarrassment lightly, especially not when it came from someone she had tried to intimidate for nearly a year. But nothing came. No fines, no threats, no midnight letters shoved into my mother's mailbox, nothing. And that silence only made my instincts scream louder. Torres and I continued gathering evidence. We were tracking every digital trail, financial reports, fake citations, HOA meeting minutes that conveniently weren't posted publicly, and even internal memos where Linda used terms like domestic containment to describe how the HOA's security force should deal with uncooperative residents. It read less like community management and more like a manual for authoritarian control. I compiled a 30-page binder and submitted it to the state attorney's office, along with video testimonies from over 20 residents, most of them elderly, many of them terrified. Still, I could feel it in my gut. Linda wasn't done. She was planning something. That something came the very next day. I was at City Hall, preparing for a town council hearing where I planned to request an emergency injunction against the HOA's private enforcement wing. My phone buzzed twice to text messages, one from Torres and one from my mother. I opened my mother's first. It was a photo of our front lawn. Someone had driven by during the night and left a crude, hand-painted sign hammered into the grass that read, "Traitor Chief, we enforce for a reason." The words were scrawled in dripping red paint. A plastic badge lay nailed below it. Torres' message was worse. "Code violation officers just showed up at the Nelson house. Fake cops again. They're back in uniform." What followed was a video. Clip grainy but clear enough. 3 members of Linda's so-called enforcement division were standing in front of a home where a 92-year-old Korean War veteran lived alone. One of the fake officers pointed at a U.S. Navy flag flying next to the front door. He said, "That needs to come down. It's not within aesthetic regulation. Last warning." The old man's trembling voice replied, "That flag flew over my ship when I was 17. And the enforcer laughed. "You'll be getting a $900 citation by morning." I gritted my teeth. They weren't just pushing back, they were escalating. And this time, they were testing how far they could go now that their fake police department had been publicly challenged. I drove straight to the Nelson house. I arrived just as the fake cops were stepping back into their unmarked SUV. They didn't recognize me at first. I wasn't in uniform. I approached the vehicle and stood in its path. "You're not going anywhere." The driver, a short, bald man named Pete, who I remembered from the funeral, opened the door slowly. "Chief Rhodes," he said, trying to sound calm. "We're within our rights. You are impersonating an officer again after being served legal warning. That's not just bold, that's felony stupid." He tried to argue, but I was already holding up my phone, recording. "Say it again." I said. "Say you're here on official enforcement." He shut his mouth tight. I turned to the others. "I want the keys, right now. Step away from the vehicle. Hands visible. You're under citizen's arrest until uniformed officers arrive." They panicked. One tried to run. "Bad move." a real cruiser rolled up just in time, Torres behind the wheel. Within minutes, all three were cuffed, their vests seized, and the SUV impounded. As they were loaded into the back seats, I could see Linda Cartwright standing across the street, arms folded, watching everything with cold, narrowed eyes. Later that night, I got a call from the mayor. "Chief, I'm getting pressure from the city planning board," he said carefully. "They're asking if it's true you're weaponizing your position to attack a legal HOA." I nearly laughed. Legal HOA? They created a fake police department and tried to shut down my father's funeral. I know, the mayor said quickly, "but their attorney just filed a defamation suit against you. Personal and professional. Linda is claiming you're leading a harassment campaign. And worse, she's filed a petition to have your position reviewed by the city council." I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the silent walls of my office. This wasn't just about my father anymore. This was a full-on war. And now they were coming after my badge. "Let her come," I said, "but make sure the council sees every file I gave to the state, every taped testimony, every resident who's been bullied by her HOA. I'm not backing down. Not now. Not when she's turning civilians into a fake militia." He sighed. "I'll do what I can. But be careful. They're playing dirty now." I hung up, then turned toward the map on my wall, one I'd printed and marked with flags and pins. Each pin represented a complaint, a citation, or an incident. There were over 60 now, and most of them were tied to one person's order. Linda Cartwright had built a paper empire of fear, but it was unraveling. What she didn't know was that I was about to make it collapse, not just as a police chief, but as a son, because when you crash a veteran's burial, threaten his widow, and terrorize a town, you don't just cross a line, you erase it. And I'll be damned if I let her redraw it. The battle for the badge. When I walked into the Cypress Pines Town Council chambers the next morning, the room was already packed. Residents filled every row of folding chairs, some standing against the back wall, others waiting outside just to listen through the open doors. Word had spread faster than I expected. The news that the HOA had filed a petition to have me removed from my position as police chief had swept across the town like wildfire. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about control, about justice, about a power-hungry group of suburban tyrants trying to dismantle real authority so they could replace it with their own brand of tyranny. At the far end of the long oak table, Mayor Preston sat in the center, flanked by the 5 council members. They looked uneasy, their eyes flicking between the gathered crowd and the thick folder in front of each of them. Folders I had personally delivered, filled with documents, testimony, and video evidence showing the HOA's descent into authoritarianism. And across from me, seated smugly with her arms folded and her lips pressed into a flat, calculating line, sat Linda Cartwright. She had come dressed for the occasion in a pristine white blazer, a pearl necklace, and a flag pin she had no right to wear. Next to her sat a man I recognized from a recent county bar meeting, Randall Geist, a private attorney known for representing HOA boards across the state. Cold, slick, and arrogant. The kind of man who could argue that rain was dry if you paid him enough. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. I wasn't the target of his performance. The council was. The mayor opened the hearing with a procedural statement outlining the purpose of the session. This emergency hearing is convened due to a formal petition submitted by the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, requesting a review of Police Chief Rhodes' conduct and the possibility of disciplinary action, including removal. The ALLEGATIONS claim misuse of authority, harassment, and incitement of community unrest. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone from the back muttered, "This is a joke." Another responded with a louder, "Let him speak." I didn't flinch. I had expected all of this, and I had come prepared. "Chief Rhodes," the mayor continued, "you may respond." I stood, calm and measured, my voice steady despite the boiling tension in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council, and members of our community," I began, "I understand the gravity of this hearing, but let me make one thing clear. This is not about a dispute between a homeowner and an association. This is not about fines or petty disagreements. This is about the illegal creation of a fake police force, about extortion, impersonation, harassment, and psychological intimidation of this town's residents. I opened my own folder and held up the first page of printed email chain. This is an internal memo from Linda Cartwright directing her so-called enforcement division to begin door-to-door compliance sweeps with instructions to create visible authority presence. This was sent to 3 individuals who are not licensed officers, who do not possess any legal jurisdiction, and who wore tactical vests with fake badge numbers purchased online. I flipped to another page. This is a signed HOA financial summary showing $27,000 redirected from the General Maintenance Fund, money paid by homeowners to purchase unmarked vehicles, replica uniforms, and surveillance equipment. Gasps and angry whispers rippled through the audience. This is a sworn statement from Mrs. Dolores Nguyen, an 81-year-old retired nurse, who was visited at 10:30 p.m. by these individuals and threatened with a $1,000 fine if she didn't remove her wind chimes because they violated nighttime noise code. That code doesn't exist. Council members, she lives alone, and they terrified her. I turned to face Linda directly. And this is a still frame taken from my father's funeral. 3 of her enforcers entered public grounds in tactical gear to interrupt a veteran's burial. My father's burial. They told grieving civilians to disperse or face penalties. The room erupted into chaos. People stood, shouted, pointed at Linda and her attorney. A few veterans in the back rows, arms crossed, eyes burning with fury. The mayor pounded his gavel, calling for order, but the council had heard enough. They weren't just hearing me. They were hearing every neighbor, every family, every voice that had been silenced by fines and fear. Geist finally stood, voice oily and smooth. Council members, let's not forget the purpose of today's hearing. Chief Rhodes has acted outside his scope. He has targeted a legal homeowners association that was simply enforcing community standards. His language and actions incited panic, and he has taken personal offense and turned it into public crusading. But the council wasn't buying it. Councilwoman Varga leaned forward. Mr. Geist, are you aware that impersonating a peace officer is a state felony? Because according to our records, your clients committed that offense repeatedly. Geist paled slightly. Linda stayed frozen, her jaw clenched tight. The mayor nodded solemnly. The council has reviewed the evidence. Effective immediately. All activities conducted under the title of HOA Enforcement Division are to be terminated. The HOA is to be placed under state audit, and a full investigation into financial misappropriation and criminal impersonation is to be launched. As for Chief Rhodes, he looked directly at me and paused for effect. This council unanimously supports your continued leadership as Chief of Police. The room exploded with applause. Cheers echoed off the chamber walls. I didn't smile. Not yet. There was still work to be done. Linda stood and, without saying a word, stormed out. But not before she turned and gave me one long, cold stare. She wasn't finished, not in her mind. And she was right. Because for people like her, defeat doesn't always bring surrender. It often brings reinvention. But I wasn't finished. Either. The legal battle was just beginning. The war was no longer just for my family. It was for the whole town. Exposing the impartwo weeks had passed since the town council hearing. The cheers had faded. The headlines had cooled. The crowd had gone home satisfied, thinking the war was over. But I knew better. I could feel it in my gut. The way a soldier senses incoming fire before the first shell falls. Linda Cartwright had vanished from public view after the council disbanded her fake enforcement squad. But the silence she left behind wasn't surrender. It was planning. And then the whispers started again. At first, it was subtle. A homeowner complained about his mailbox being knocked down during the night. Another found her porch railing spray-painted with the word LIAR. An elderly couple discovered that their garden beds had been trampled, their American flag torn off the post and shredded across their lawn. The attacks weren't random. They were targeted, and all of them shared one common link. They had publicly supported me at the hearing. I knew what this was: retaliation, covert, quiet, and cowardly. But the final straw wasn't one act of vandalism. It was what I found one Thursday evening, just past 9 p.m. As I pulled into my mother's driveway after work. The porch light was off. Strange. Since Mom never forgot to leave it on when she knew I was coming, I stepped out of the cruiser, slowly, hand instinctively dropping to the sidearm at my hip. Then I saw it, the shadow darting from the side yard, the crunch of gravel under quick feet, and the faint glint of something metallic tossed into the bushes. I drew my weapon, flashlight in the other hand, and followed. What I found was a gasoline can, still sloshing, and a crumpled bundle of newspaper wrapped around a half-used matchbook, abandoned just feet from the back wall of the house. They had tried to set my childhood home on fire. With my mother inside, the rage that boiled up inside me was unlike anything I had felt in years, not even during deployments, not even during standoffs. This wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't politics. This was a domestic terror campaign, being waged by desperate people who had tasted power and couldn't stand to have it ripped away. The forensic team found partial fingerprints on the canister. We traced them to a young man named Keaton Mallory, age 24, a part-time landscaper. No criminal record, but a known friend of Greg Bomber, the same HOA board member who had been arrested outside the Nelson house. Keaton was picked up at a gas station 2 miles from my house. He cracked under questioning. He admitted it was Linda's idea. She said the chief needed a message. He mumbled, eyes glassy, fingers twitching nervously. Said no one would get hurt. Just scare him. Show him what happens to traitors. We arrested him on attempted arson and domestic terrorism charges. That was the moment everything shifted. The state attorney general, now alarmed by the escalation and the attention it was getting, authorized a full investigation into the HOA under organized crime statutes. What had once been dismissed as just a neighborhood spat was now a case file, stacked thick with fraud, harassment, impersonation, property destruction, and now attempted murder. I watched as subpoenas were served, financial accounts frozen, and HOA meetings placed under surveillance. The once pristine Pine Ridge Community Center became a crime scene, yellow tape fluttering on the front door like a badge of shame. We uncovered secret slush funds hidden behind shell companies, all tied back to Linda and her inner circle, kickbacks from construction vendors, under-the-table deals with inspection officers, even blackmail threats against residents who had once dared to run against her in board elections. The town was stunned. The news spread like a brush fire through social media and local press. Residents who had once stayed silent began to speak out. Emboldened by the legal action and public outrage, more than 50 families came forward, some with stories that chilled me to my core. Disabled veterans threatened with eviction, widows fined for lawn negligence while recovering from surgery, one family whose autistic son had been denied a backyard sensory garden because it violated visual uniformity. They hadn't just abused power, they had preyed on the vulnerable. I met with the district court judge overseeing the charges and gave my testimony in a closed-door session that lasted nearly 4 hours. I laid out every file, every complaint, every false badge and phony citation. I made my case not just as a police officer but as a son, as a citizen of a town that had nearly let rot take over its roads. That evening, I returned home to find an envelope on my doorstep. No postage, just my name written in tight, delicate handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph that it was from my father's funeral, a wide shot. You could see the casket, the folded flag in my mother's hands, and in the background, circled in red ink, was Linda Cartwright, standing at the edge of the crowd, smirking. Below it, in block letters, "This isn't over." But what Linda didn't understand, and maybe never would, is that the moment she disrupted my father's burial, the moment she dared to violate sacred ground with her ego and Fox authority, she lit a fire that she could never contain. Because I wasn't just defending my title, I was defending memory, honor, the legacy of a man who had bled for this country and spent his final years watching bureaucratic tyrants treat veterans like inconveniences. And I wasn't alone anymore. The town had rallied. The people had awakened. And Linda Cartwright, she had become a name synonymous with corruption, disgrace, and delusion. The state pressed charges. The FBI opened a secondary investigation into possible RICO violations. And as Linda was taken into custody, pale, stunned, handcuffed on the Very sidewalk she once ruled over. I stood across the street beside my mother, watching in silence. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes were full of pride, quiet, deep, unshakable pride. And my father, somewhere, I knew he was watching, too, because justice had finally come to Pine Ridge. Not with sirens, but with truth. And it had a badge. The legacy of a flagpole a month after Linda Cartwright was led away in handcuffs. The neighborhood of Pine Ridge Estates had changed visibly, spiritually, and profoundly. The fake police uniforms were gone. The HOA signs had been stripped from every post. The community center, once the command post of Linda's self-made empire, had been boarded up, pending court-ordered restructuring. The grass, once obsessively trimmed and chemically bleached for uniformity, now grew freely in patches along sidewalks, as if exhaling after years of forced conformity. It was imperfect, it was alive, and it was beautiful. Yet, even with Linda gone and her minions scattered like dust in a windstorm, the damage she left behind lingered in quiet ways. Some residents still peeked nervously out their windows when city inspectors drove by. Others, especially the elderly and the isolated, remained hesitant to speak too loudly, too freely. That kind of fear doesn't vanish with a single court ruling. It takes time, it takes healing. But that's where real leadership comes in, not just from people in uniform, but from neighbors, families, and friends who choose to rebuild trust, one act at a time. That was why, on the first Saturday of October, I stood beneath the old oak tree on my parents' lawn with a shovel in hand, surrounded by half a dozen volunteers, as we planted fresh garden beds where the soil had once been poisoned by petty fines and stress. My mother watched from the porch, a cup of warm cider in her hands, a soft smile on her lips. She hadn't smiled like that since before the funeral. "You sure you want daisies?" I asked her, glancing back. "Your father liked the white ones," she replied, said they reminded him of silence after combat. That shut me up quick. The new HOA board, handpicked by residents in a special election, had already passed measures to restore individual freedoms, revoke all unlawful citations, and reallocate funds to mental health and veterans support programs. They also reinstated the original community charter, stripping it of the amendments Linda had snuck in over the years. But that wasn't enough. Not for me. There was still one piece of unfinished business, that flagpole, the one they tried to make my father tear down, the one they cited over and over for non-standard display, the one he had polished every Sunday morning without fail. It had been bent in half during the HOA's final months sawn near the base, and left leaning like a wounded soldier. That Sunday, I returned with a new pole, taller, thicker, forged from stainless steel and engraved with my father's service number at its base. I set it into the concrete myself, my hands shaking not from fatigue but from reverence. When it was upright and secured, I unfolded a new flag, one that had flown over the Capitol in honor of fallen veterans. I raised it slowly, the fabric catching wind as if it had been waiting to breathe again. And when it reached the top, the neighborhood grew quiet. People emerged from their homes. Veterans saluted. Children placed hands over hearts. Even strangers stopped their cars along the road to watch. I looked up at that flag and didn't see a victory over Linda or her HOA cult. I saw my father. I saw every name etched into the marble stones at Arlington. I saw a community reclaiming its soul. Later that day, I received a phone call from the assistant state attorney. Linda Cartwright had accepted a plea deal, 10 years in state prison for conspiracy, impersonation, and racketeering. She would forfeit her home, her assets, and her voting rights on any neighborhood board for life. The judge called her behavior one of the most grotesque misuses of community leadership in state history. It was justice, not vengeance. And that made all the difference. I spent the following weeks visiting residents who had been hurt most deeply by the HOA's reign. I helped Mrs. Nguyen install her birdbath again. I arranged for Daryl, the retired Marine, to get a new Corps flag installed by his porch. I personally assisted the Nelsons with legal assistance so they could sue for emotional damages. None of it erased what had happened, but it made the rebuilding feel real. One afternoon, while clearing old HOA mailers from my parents' attic, I found something tucked behind my dad's army footlocker, A sealed letter, addressed to me. In his clean, steady handwriting, it read, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone on ahead. I always knew this house and this town would one day need you more than I ever could. There will always be people who mistake control for leadership. Don't fight them to win. Fight them to remind the world what dignity looks like, what justice sounds like, and what honor truly means. Keep the flag flying high, son. Not for me, for everyone still watching." I closed the letter with a trembling hand, and I finally wept not from grief, but from pride, because I had fought the battle he didn't live to see, and I had won it with his voice still echoing in my chest. The flag waved that evening in a soft, autumn breeze, casting long shadows across the lawn, a symbol reclaimed, a community restored, and a legacy that would never again be silenced by paper tyrants.